Toys. We all played with them as youngsters, and we all remember our favorites. However, did you know that some toys that are now highly collectible were manufactured right here in Cincinnati? Hello, I'm Michael Baker, and today my guest is Andy Balterman. Andy is here to share with us some of the stories and memories of the Stuart Manufacturing Company, a company owned and operated by his father during the 1950s and 1960s. Stuart Manufacturing produced many toys and action figures that are now sought highly after by many toy collectors. Good afternoon, Andy.
Hello.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come down on the snow and be with us today.
Thanks for the invite. It's fun to talk about my past.
Well, that's great. And let's kind of start off, I know that you've probably got a lot of really fond memories growing up in the toy manufacturing industry, and then I know I would love to hear some of them. Is there anything that you can think of, kind of a special story that kind of brings to mind?
I have pardon the expression, a sociological or a psychological approach to this. I fear as my life goes by that my friends and family remember my life better than I do, and I hear stories about things having to do with this subject and others that I don't recall. And so at a time like this, you can't be sure whether you're remembering real memories or manufactured memories. I, of course, remember that my father was a toy maker, and that's a pretty cool thing for a kid, even a redheaded kid, to brag about. Later in life, I was able to, and still able to, brag about my mother, who's a local artist of some renown, and I like to refer to myself as one of her masterpieces, like I was one of my father's toys. I'm not so sure, but he was a small toy manufacturer in an era when such things were possible. There are very few small toy companies anymore. It's all shareholders and profit margins and test marketing and buyouts and such, and so the history of toys in Cincinnati has been affected by that. But when my father was making toys, I fear I was too young to remember today a lot about it, and even perhaps in some ways too young to be excited about it in the here and now. One of my fondest memories is going down to my dad's company and he putting me into a cardboard box, putting me on a two-wheeler, and rolling me around in this enclosed box. All kids love being hidden away. And to think now at this juncture in life that I thought that was more cool than looking at the toys and having fun with the toys, it's very strange. The other memory I have is that I grew up in North Avondale and never had brothers, and yet in third or maybe fifth grade, a family moved in next door who had a kid my age. A boy next door moved in, and it was fabulous. But the strange thing was that boy's father made toys as well in Cincinnati. And at one point in history, not only were we next door neighbors residentially, but we were across the street from each other at the corner of Central Avenue and Fifth Street. Our companies were across the street from one another. So it was sort of an odd fraternity. His father made, among other things, the 8-ball, which everyone knows. Mm-hmm. But today, as you mentioned, more and more people are knowing and remembering my father's toys.
And speaking of your father, Dexter, I know that basically during the war he was a scientist and made penicillin and then got into toy manufacture. I mean, how vastly different is that? What's
the story there?
Yeah, what's the story there? How do you get involved in that?
Not a myth, a family legend that he was. He went down to the University of Illinois, having grown up in Chicago, and was interested. I can't remember, biology perhaps, but the folks at the biology office were gone out to lunch. So he leaned against the door, waiting for somebody to come back, and started up a conversation with somebody similarly situated across the hall, who was in the, if I'm remembering correctly at a time like this, bacteriology department. And just by that strange, not coincidence, but moment, he ended up entering that program, becoming a bacteriologist. The war came. He more or less simultaneously met my mother, lived during the war, found a job innocently meaning it wasn't like the Vietnam War where you tried to find jobs that would get you deferred. He was in this field, and he got a job in Shenley down in Lawrenceburg, where they were making, during the war, penicillin. And things got serious with Mom and Dad. They got married. He moved to Cincinnati. He was commuting to Lawrenceburg. Then, I guess, as such things happen, kids started forming an image in my mother's and father's brain, and they realized that he couldn't raise a family as a bacteriologist in this situation, especially as the war, of course, was ending and did end. And so, casting about, he ended up buying a partnership in a company that was based in Cincinnati, and that was making nightlights. And that was the Stuart Manufacturing Company, started by another man who stayed on after my father bought it, and the rest, for some, is history.
Well, I know, that they've made the nightlights first, so how did it kind of develop into making, action figures? I mean, what's the story behind that?
Well, I wish I knew, end of interview. I wish I knew the details here. My father passed away about 3 years ago, ripe old age of 90, and I guess I didn't take enough notes, but at some juncture, a company that had the rights to a Roy Rogers promotional set offered them to my father's company. He accepted as a transaction, and he was therefore the licensor of this set, which he was free to make use of the figures within, not the ranch that was made of cardboard that the figures were placed in, and that was a promotion that was short-lived. And
it's a double R ranch, if I'm not mistaken.
Roy Rogers, and once he was given the rights to it, he couldn't call it Roy Rogers Texas TV Ranger. I hope I'm remembering correctly. And the figures were interesting and fun and exciting, and they sold, and so he ran with it and created numerous other variations of it with my mother's help sometimes in terms of doing research, library research. Maybe that's how I ended up becoming a librarian. My mother and father made use of the library to help create these toys. And so, yes, a number, I think maybe it's 45 approximately, Western play sets, as they're called now by collectors, were eventually created. I happen to have
with you,
in original packaging, which collectors might be waiting for me outside of the parking lot to take, but this is, what is it? Cavalry Patrol. Interestingly packaged with a three-dimensional effect with the cardboard wheel, but it's just the horse, the human figures, some accessories like saddles, reins, rifles. I cannot tell you how expensive some of these are on the collectible circuit now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I see 59 cents, and I can bet on eBay we're talking $200 or $300.
Sometimes it's much more reasonable. Certain colors these days of horses, for instance. The horses are very popular in the collector circles. They just feel, and not without some justification, that they're just they have a very classy proportionality and what's the right word? Posture. They can stand or stand, two-leg or four-leg, and if the camera can see the sort of marbleizing of this horse, I don't know. I'm not a collector. I've given up trying to collect beyond what I already inherited. But there are certain colors that make these collectors swoon.
And I'm a little curious, too. I know that you guys really premiered a lot of these toys. Why do you think that Stuart excelled with this particular type of toy?
It may, well, like with any product, I guess, from concept to execution. A company in, I think, Columbus, Indiana, Como Plastics, created the molds. I don't know if that means they designed them. If so, of course, that has to be a great credit to them. But then beyond that, there is, of course, the packaging, which I've always liked, and the novelty of the approach. I remember my mother talking about how she researched a travois, a Indian baby or luggage, freight, I don't know what word to use, carrier, two long sticks that come to a V behind a horse with an animal skin, and they would pull that behind the horse, and these things were just not known, not seen in toys. Added to that was a fascination engendered by television, TV Western heroes, were big news Sputnik, and so it was a natural fit. Interesting looking toys. Kids love, or used to love at least, little inanimate objects to play with and fantasize with. Colorful. The rest.
I mean, it almost sounds like it's historic and educational.
Certainly.
And then, since you were kind of a forerunner in this type of toy, then when the TV generation, started going on, I mean, they saw the same kind of things. Oh, look, she's got that little caboose baby that she's carrying, just like this toy that I have.
Yeah,
so it really kind of brought it to life. I mean, it was an incredible part of your history, for sure.
I mentioned a moment ago the role of television. I can't be sure if that's valid in an intellectual way or not. But it's interesting to me that once the Western materials perhaps declined in popularity, my father knew or sensed what the next phase was, as I just mentioned, science. The era of science in the late 50s, early 60s certainly took off, especially thanks to NASA, if that was the name of it then, and the space program. And so, following a great variety of playset figures, became a interesting variety of science sets, as we call them. Very well designed. Again, I love the graphics of this. I've never been able to find out who did this work. If anybody knows, please let me know. But here is a science set for invisible writing. How interesting. A kid in the brochure looks like me, but sadly, I never had such glory. But this is the real thing, still in the original packaging, as the collectors would say. Hopefully nothing too explosive in those chemical canisters. But we made science sets this size and smaller optical illusions and other variations. And there's actually bigger size than this that I have that's too big for the studio. And so that was an interesting evolution, I think, in retrospect, that the company went through.
Well, I got a question because I remember as a child playing with a lot of these toys. I might not look that old, but I do remember some of these for some strange reason. I know that the Stuart also had a whole line of Western products that you acquired from C.F. Block and Associates, I believe.
Well, that was we covered that. That's the Roy Rogers.
Okay.
Block owned and created the Roy Rogers set.
I was a little confused there.
Yeah, that's the timeline is that Block, Roy Rogers, post-serial premium, I think it was offered as, selling that off to my father, running with it with Western.
And that's where you went to New York to the toys.
Well, the Toy Fair, a great phrase for a kid's imagination. Every year my father went to the Toy Fair in New York City, which still occurs, where manufacturers of all ilk and size will present their wares and try to, it reminds me in a sense of something like Sundance Film Festival, where you present your product and you hope a distributor
picks it up.
And that's what he went every year with these toys, the Toy Fair. Sounds redundant, but it was an affair.
Well, I know, too, that right now that you have something going on at the public library. I know you're wearing one of their shirts. You want to tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I work in the art and music department, and the names of the departments down in the library, education, religion, is another example. Don't tell the whole story about what subjects are indeed placed in those departments. And in the art and music department is a huge array of material relating to collectibles, especially since the advent of Antique Roadshow, thank you WCET, the interest in the public of evaluating this or that treasure is intense. And we have many resources to investigate fine furniture, bobbleheads, coins, old toys, you name it. We have many resources, and that's one of the things I get to do. I've never had anybody come in, though, and ask about Stuart toys. Maybe I will now that this has happened.
Well, I definitely hope so. And I'm going to ask you about that website. We talked about that.
Well, there
See if
is.
you can remember that name.
I can avoid reaching for a paper and telling you this URL, this web address. A woman in Florida, and that's another story I guess we don't have time for, has created a website. She never could figure out. She knew that Stuart was from Cincinnati, but she thought that there was a Mr. Stuart. Well, one fine day she discovered, Elizabeth West is the woman in Florida who discovered that there's no Mr. Stuart, there's Mr. Balterman, and that really revved up her website. And if you would use the search engine of your choice, whether it be Google or another alternative, you input the words elusive Stuarts, just that phrase, or those two words actually, elusive and then Stuarts, you'll land there and see history and visuals and even a discussion group on Yahoo where people talk back and forth, trade back and forth, and the community grows.
Well, Andy, for every baby boomer that grew up with your family, we'd like to thank you for all the great toys we had when we were young.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you coming down today talking to us.
It's been fun.
This has been Michael Baker with CETconnect.org.